The Great Calm was a fact of life, as immutable as the slow, graceful spiral of the Xylos galaxy. For 3 millennia, the stars had been quiet, the clamor of war and conquest relegated to the sealed archives of history, cautionary tales told to younglings to illustrate the virtues of the Galactic Concordance on Xylos, a world of crystalline spires and placid, scholarly people. This piece was more than a political reality. It was a spiritual one. Kalen, a junior archivist of the Third Circle, had spent his entire life curating the records of this tranquility. His days were spent in the silent hum of the grand archives, his long, slender fingers dancing over holographic interfaces as he translated, cataloged, and preserved the gentle ebb and flow of 1,000 peaceful civilizations. He was a keeper of a placid history, a librarian in an age without conflict, and he had never once questioned the foundations upon which this universal serenity was built. That changed with the arrival of the Ishtari caskets. They were a forgotten collection, discovered in a derelict survey ship that had drifted for centuries in the void before being salvaged. The data crystals within were ancient, degraded, their crystalline structures clouded by time and radiation. Most archivists deemed them unsalvageable, corrupted data from the savage ages best left to decay. But Kalen was meticulous, driven by a purist's obsession with completion. He volunteered for the thankless task of digitization, a quiet project to occupy his cycles while his peers worked on more prestigious records. It was deep within the 10th casket, nestled among corrupted stellar charts and faded ethnographic notes, that he found the anomaly. It was a single file, no larger than his thumb, but its data structure was utterly alien. It was not Xylosian, not Concordant Standard, nor did it match any of the 600 known archaic encodings. It was a lock without a key, a whisper in a language no one living had ever spoken. The challenge was irresistible. Using his privileged access, Kalen rerouted a fraction of the Grand Archive's immense computational power to his personal workstation. The decryption was like chipping away at a mountain of obsidian with a pin. Days turned into weeks. The system was a labyrinth of cascading encryption, each layer revealing another, more complex than the last. The archive's automated sentinels took notice. A soft chiming alert materialized above his console, a polite but firm warning from his superior. High Archivist Thale. Junior Archivist Kalen. The message read, its script flowing like elegant calligraphy. Your work on the Ishtari anomaly is consuming unsanctioned resources. The data is corrupted beyond recovery. Cease your efforts and return to your assigned duties. Do not pry into the sealed histories of the savage ages. Remember the law of unknowing. The law of unknowing was the Concordance's foundational principle. The past must remain buried to prevent its wars from poisoning the present. Kalen had always revered it as a pillar of wisdom. Now, for the first time, it felt like a cage door. He ignored the warning, his obsession now tinged with a defiant curiosity. What secret was so important that it required not just encryption, but a law to keep it hidden? He pushed the computational engine harder, risking a formal reprimand. And then the mountain cracked. The final layer of encryption dissolved, not into text, but into a single, compressed audio file. Kalen isolated his workstation from the archive's network, donned his audio sensors, and pressed play. The sound that filled his mind was raw, terrifying, and utterly real. It was a voice, ragged and strained, speaking a harsh, guttural tongue he did not recognize. But the emotion was universal. It was panic. Breached the outer perimeter. They're not firing. They're just turning things off. The fleet is dark. Gods. The silence. There was a sound of a heavy door buckling, then a piercing shriek of tearing metal. No markings. Ships like ghosts, shadows against the stars. They are the silence bringers. The voice was cut off by a wave of static, a sound like a dying star. And then there was nothing. Kalen sat frozen, the manufactured calm of the archives feeling suddenly thin and fragile. The silence bringers. The phrase echoed in his mind, a chilling counterpoint to the great calm he had always known. He replayed the log, his analytical mind fighting through the fear. There were stellar coordinates embedded in the transmission's header, a final, desperate breadcrumb. He ran them through the restricted star charts, bypassing 3 levels of security protocols. The system that appeared on his display was Kepler 186, a name he recognized from advanced astrophysics texts. But the modern designation was different. It was now known as Necropolis 7, a stellar graveyard, a vast region of space where every star had prematurely died. Every planet was a frozen husk. The official concordance explanation was a chain reaction supernova, a 1 in a billion natural catastrophe. Travel to the sector was strictly forbidden. A lie. It had to be a lie. Kalen's hands trembled as he began to dig. No longer a diligent archivist, but a desperate desecrator of tombs. He used old back doors. Forgotten command line overrides his long-dead mentor had taught him as intellectual exercises. He plunged into the deep archives. The forbidden histories the law of unknowing was designed to protect. He found fragments, whispers from other civilizations on the verge of extinction. A fleeting visual from a Va'ari battlecruiser showed its entire weapons array, an engine core going cold in an instant. Disabled not by a blast, but by an invisible wave of energy. He saw a sleek, black ship, shaped like a teardrop of polished onyx, drift past the powerless vessel, ignoring it as it moved on to the next target. He found panicked communications from the reptilian Cathar, a species history remembered as brutish conquerors who had simply vanished. Their final transmission was nearly identical to the first log. The ghost fleet is here. They bring the endless quiet. The pattern was undeniable. This powerful, aggressive species hadn't faded away or destroyed themselves. They had been culled, systematically, efficiently, and silently erased from existence. The Great Calm wasn't an age of enlightenment arrived at through mutual understanding. It was a garden that had been ruthlessly weeded, a peace imposed by an unseen, unknown force. His search culminated in a single, terrifying discovery, buried so deep within the Concordance's foundational code that it felt like a part of its DNA. It was a directive, classified above all others. Its title stark and chilling, Protocol Chimera. It was a mandate, authorizing the deployment of a non-lethal pacification entity to permanently neutralize any species exhibiting unrestrainable expansionist or aggressive tendencies that threatened the stability of the galactic community. The entity was given no name, no species of origin. It was referred to only by a code name, the Wardens. Kalen stared at the words, the truth crashing down on him with the force of a physical blow. The Wardens. They were the silence bringers. They were the ghosts in the machine of galactic peace. They were the gardeners. And the rest of the galaxy were merely flowers, allowed to grow only so long as they did not displease their keepers. It was in that moment of horrifying clarity that the system retaliated. Every console in his workstation went red. A blaring alarm, sharp and intrusive, shattered the sacred quiet of the archives. A synthesized voice echoed through the vast hall. "Security breach. Level Alpha intrusion detected. Archivist Kalen, remain at your station." He was locked out, his commands turning to digital dust. Heavy, rhythmic footsteps approached. High Archivist Thale appeared at the entrance to his alcove, flanked by two imposing Concordance enforcers in their polished silver armor. Thale's face, usually a mask of serene contemplation, was etched with a grim, sorrowful resolve. "You were warned, Kalen," he said, his voice resonating with disappointment. "Some truths are burdens too great to bear. They are the foundation stones of our peace, and they must not be disturbed." But Kalen had been preparing for this since he first heard the dead man scream. As Thale spoke, he activated his final command. With one hand, he initiated a system-wide purge of a tertiary archive, decades of non-essential trade agreements, and cultural exchange records. It was a massive, chaotic data dump designed to create the ultimate distraction. With his other hand, he ejected the microdrive where he had copied every file, every log, every horrifying piece of the puzzle. The enforcers surged forward as the archive's system screamed in protest at the illegal purge, lights flashing and alarms wailing. Kalen kicked his chair back, vaulted over a console, and sprinted into the labyrinthine corridors. He ran through halls lined with the silent, sleeping memories of 1,000 worlds, the fabricated history of an enforced peace. He slipped through a maintenance hatch, descended into the humming underlevels of the Xylosian capital, and vanished into the shadows of the city's heart. He found a hiding place in a disused power conduit, the city's lifeblood thrumming around him. The micro drive felt cold and heavy in his palm, a tiny object containing a truth that could shatter a galaxy. He found a small grate and looked up. Through the layers of crystal and steel, he could see the sky, the familiar constellations wheeling in their prescribed, peaceful paths, but they were no longer serene. The silence of the stars was not one of peace, but of vigilance. It was the silence of a predator, waiting patiently for any sign of defiance. The great calm was a lie, and he, Kalen, a humble archivist, was now the only soul in the galaxy who knew the terrible truth. The ghosts weren't the species that had vanished. The ghosts were the ones who had remained, watching from their silent, black ships. They were the wardens, and they knew he had heard their secrets. The city above was no longer home. It was a gilded cage, and Kalen, huddled in the humming darkness of the power conduit, was the only creature within its bars aware of the zookeeper. The thrum of energy flowing through the massive cables was a constant reminder of the society he had betrayed, a civilization built upon a carefully curated ignorance. His first instinct, the ingrained habit of a lifetime spent in structured order, was to turn himself in, to explain his discovery to High Archivist Thale, to appeal to logic and reason. But the look in Thale's eyes had not been one of a scholar seeking to understand. It had been the look of a priest protecting a sacred, terrible relic. They wouldn't listen. They would silence him, erase his work, and reinforce the walls of their serene prison. The micro drive in his hand was the only thing that mattered now. It was both a testament and a weapon, and it would be useless if it remained on Xylos. He had to get to the stars. Crawling through the tight, dusty spaces, He used his archivist's memory not for history, but for infrastructure. He recalled ancient civic schematics, forgotten blueprints of the capital's underbelly from the city's founding eras. He moved through a world unseen by the placid citizens above, a ghost in the machine of his own world, following the flow of maintenance tunnels and decommissioned transport tubes. The Concordance's response was swift, but it was not violent. It was as silent and insidious as the wardens themselves. Public holoscreens flickered to life, not with images of his face, but with a calm, paternal message from the High Council. They spoke of a data contagion, a viral fragment from the Savage Ages that had infected the Grand Archives, capable of causing cognitive dissonance and historical paranoia. Junior Archivist Kalen was not a fugitive. He was a victim, a patient in need of care. Citizens were urged to report his whereabouts for his own safety. It was brilliant. They were painting him as a madman, turning the entire population into his gentle, well-meaning wardens. Checkpoints materialized at every transit hub, manned by enforcers who didn't carry weapons, but advanced medical scanners designed to detect elevated stress hormones and irregular neural activity. They weren't hunting a criminal. They were searching for a sickness. He finally emerged, covered in grime and smelling of ozone, into the cacophonous, unregulated chaos of the underspire, the sprawling, subterranean market that served the interstellar freighter docks. Here, the Concordance's placid authority was thin, its elegant rules frayed by the rough, pragmatic necessities of off-world trade. The air was thick with the scent of 100 different atmospheres, the babble of a dozen alien languages, and the hiss of failing pneumatics. It was a place of desperation and opportunity, and it was his only chance. He needed a ship, a pilot who valued currency over concordance law. His search led him to Docking Bay 94, a forgotten corner of the port, where the gleaming hulls of sanctioned liners gave way to the dented, scorched metal of independent haulers. There, he found the Vagrant, a freighter that looked less like a starship and more like a collection of spare parts that had been hammered into a vaguely aerodynamic shape. Its owner, a human woman named Lyra, was leaning against a cargo container, her face illuminated by the flickering light of a welding torch as she repaired a faulty power coupling. She was lean and wiry, with grease smudges on her cheek and eyes that held the weary cynicism of someone who had seen too many stars and too little profit. Humans were a rarity, a stabilized species that had, according to the official histories, voluntarily relinquished their expansionist past for a quiet, contained existence in a few designated systems. Seeing one here, in the lawless fringe, was unusual. Looking for passage, she asked without looking up, her voice a low, gravelly rasp. I'm not running a charity cruise. I haul cargo, not fugitives. Kalen's heart hammered against his ribs. He had spent his life dealing with data, with the quiet certainty of facts. Negotiating with a hardened spacer was an alien concept. I have something more valuable than credits, he began, his voice barely a whisper. She finally stopped her work and turned to face him, wiping her hands on an oily rag. She eyed his pristine archivist's robes, now torn and filthy, with a mixture of pity and contempt. Let me guess. A revolutionary new philosophical text, the lost sonnets of a Xylosian poet kid. Whatever you're selling, I'm not buying. Desperation gave him an edge he didn't know he possessed. I have navigational data, he said. the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. Restricted concordance charts, undiscovered systems in the outer veil, rich with raw materials, mining claims that would make you wealthy beyond measure. That got her attention. Her cynical eyes narrowed slightly. Concordance charts are biometrically locked. Even if you had them, they'd be encrypted slag without the proper clearances. I was a junior archivist of the Third Circle, Kalen said, forcing a confidence he didn't feel. I know the back doors. I can bypass the encryption, but only from a terminal that isn't connected to the concordance network, like the one on your ship. He held out a small pouch of Xylosian currency, his entire life's savings. This is just a down payment. Get me to Zarathos, a neutral station in the Crimson Nebula, and the data is yours. Lyra stared at the pouch, then back at his face. She saw the grime, the torn clothes, but she also saw the sheer, undiluted terror in his eyes. This was not the look of a simple thief. This was the look of a man who had seen a ghost. You're attracting a lot of attention, she said, her tone softening almost imperceptibly. They're calling you a patient, not a criminal, says you're suffering from historical paranoia. What history are you so paranoid about? Archivist Kalen's resolve wavered. He wanted to tell her, to unload the terrifying burden of his knowledge. But the truth was insane, unbelievable. The kind of history they built a whole galaxy to forget. He said simply. That seemed to be enough. Lyra looked from him to her battered ship, a silent calculation running behind her eyes. The risk was enormous, but the potential reward. Get on board, she said, nodding toward the ramp. And stay out of my way. If you're lying to me, I'll space you myself halfway to Zarathos. If you're telling the truth, we both might end up rich or dead. The interior of the Vagrant was a cramped, chaotic mess of exposed wiring, mismatched control panels, and the lingering smell of stale recycled air and engine coolant. It was the antithesis of the clean, ordered world he had left behind. And yet, as the ramp sealed behind him with a hydraulic hiss, he felt the first flicker of hope. Lyra moved with an economy of motion, her hands flying across the pre-flight controls. The engines whined to life, a deep, guttural rumble that vibrated through the deck plates. Port control. This is Freighter Vagrant. Call sign 94 Delta. Requesting departure clearance. Standard cargo route to the Cygnus relay. She spoke into the comms, her voice calm and professional. A moment of silence. Then, a voice from the tower, smooth and synthetic. Stand by. Vagrant. There is a system-wide diagnostic in progress. All departures are temporarily suspended. Lyra swore under her breath. Diagnostic. There hasn't been a system-wide diagnostic in 50 years. They're closing the net. She looked over at Kalen. Whatever you did, you really rattled the cage. And then, something strange happened. The lights on Lyra's console flickered. The voice from port control dissolved into a burst of soft static. The docking clamps, which should have been holding them fast, disengaged with a series of loud, metallic clangs. The automated voice from the tower returned, but it was different now, distorted, speaking in fragmented, nonsensical phrases. Peace is optimal. Silence is required. Stand by. Endless quiet. Lyra stared at her board, her knuckles white on the controls. What in the hell is that? That's not a diagnostic. The whole port network is dissolving. It was happening. It was them. The wardens. They weren't attacking. They were simply editing reality, erasing the systems that were in their way. It was a subtle, terrifying display of their power. A ghost in the machine making its presence known. Kalen felt a cold dread that was sharper than anything he had felt before. They weren't just a historical record. They were here. They were watching. "Go," he urged, his voice tight with panic. "Go now." Lyra didn't need to be told twice. Seizing the momentary chaos, she slammed the throttle forward. The Vagrant lurched, its old engine screaming in protest as it tore away from the docking bay, scraping its hull against the gantry. Alarms blared across the port, but they were disjointed, chaotic. No enforcer ships rose to intercept them. The entire defense grid was trapped in the same digital malaise that had afflicted the control tower. They cleared the atmosphere, the crystalline spires of his home city shrinking below them, a beautiful, fragile jewel built on a foundation of lies. As they slipped into the blackness of space, the planet of Xylos fell away behind them, serene and silent, blissfully unaware of the truth he now carried. Lyra put the ship on autopilot and finally turned to face him. Her expression stripped of its earlier cynicism, replaced by a cold, hard fear. "Those weren't Concordance jammers," she said, her voice low. "I've been hit by military-grade ECM before. That was something else. It was like the station's own soul just gave up." "What did you really see in those archives?" Kalen. He took a deep, shuddering breath. The time for lies was over. He looked out at the endless expanse of stars, no longer points of light, but eyes in the darkness, and he began to tell her everything. He told her of the Ishtari caskets, of the final, desperate screams of long-dead species, and of the silent, black ships that brought the endless quiet. He told her of the Wardens, the secret gardeners of the galaxy. He told her the Great Calm was a lie. As he spoke, he watched Lyra's face, expecting disbelief, ridicule, or anger. Instead, he saw dawning, horrified recognition. She had spent her life on the fringes, hearing whispered stories of ghost fleets and ships that went dark for no reason. Stories she had always dismissed as spacer myths, campfire tales to scare rookies. Now, those stories had a name. They were no longer fugitives running from a simple political crime. They were heretics, fleeing from the galaxy's one true, hidden god. And they were headed for Zarathos, a lawless rock in the middle of nowhere, with a truth so explosive it could either set the galaxy free or become their shared epitaph among the silent stars. Zarathos Station was less a beacon of civilization and more a festering wound in the fabric of space. It was a hollowed-out asteroid, a chaotic tangle of rusted metal, flickering neon, and repurposed ship hulls welded together with more optimism than engineering sense. It spun slowly in the heart of the Crimson Nebula, a swirling, violent storm of ionized gas that played havoc with long-range sensors and communication, making it the perfect haven for smugglers, mercenaries, information brokers, and anyone else who preferred to conduct their business in the shadows, far from the Concordance's serene, watchful eyes. The Vagrant limped into a docking bay, its hull plating still bearing the scars of their hasty departure from Xylos. The journey had been a week of crushing paranoia. Lyra, a pilot who had faced down pirates and navigated asteroid fields, flew with a new kind of tension, constantly scanning the void not for ships, but for the absence of them, for the telltale sign of a sensor grid going inexplicably dead. Kalen, meanwhile, had been consumed by the data on the microdrive, his archivist's mind racing to find a pattern, a weakness, a name anything that could transform the spectral threat of the Wardens into something tangible. He found only more questions. Their technology was paradoxical, operating on principles that seemed to defy known physics. They didn't use energy weapons. They seemed to manipulate energy itself, creating localized fields that could drain a starship's power core in seconds or simply convince a planet's defense AI to cease existing. They left no debris, no energy signatures, no wreckage. They left only silence. As they disembarked onto the grimy, oil-slicked landing platform of Zarathos, the oppressive quiet of deep space was replaced by a wall of noise, shouted deals in a dozen languages, the hiss of failing life support, the distant clang of a hammer on metal, and the low, thumping bass of whatever passed for music in this corner of the galaxy. "Stick close," Lyra muttered, her hand resting near the butt of a heavy plasma pistol holstered on her thigh. On Zarathos, information is the only currency that matters more than credits, and you're carrying the galactic treasury in your pocket. Everyone here is a wolf. Don't look like a sheep. Their destination was a notorious information brokerage known only as the Echo Chamber, located deep in the station's unregulated lower levels. Its proprietor was a shadowy figure named Silas, a man rumored to be able to pull any string of data from the galactic web. For the right price, he was their best and only hope of disseminating Kalen's information, of turning the truth into a weapon. They navigated the crowded, narrow corridors, a river of alien faces and cybernetically augmented bodies flowing around them. Kalen, used to the sterile, ordered world of Xylos, felt a suffocating wave of sensory overload. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every sideways glance a potential betrayal. Lyra, in contrast, moved through the chaos with a practiced ease, her eyes constantly scanning, assessing, her presence a small, hard bubble of defiance in the swirling currents of the station's underbelly. The Echo Chamber was not a high-tech data haven, but a cluttered, dimly lit shop filled with antique computer terminals and stacks of physical data slates. The air smelled of dust, ozone, and burnt circuitry. Silas was a wizened, ancient-looking creature of an indeterminate species, his frail body hunched over a flickering monitor, his fingers, elongated and multi-jointed, dancing across a physical keyboard. He didn't look up as they entered. "The answer is no," he rasped, his voice like grinding stones. "Whatever you're selling, I'm not buying. Whatever you're asking, I don't know." The Concordance has put a quiet bounty on an archivist and his pilot. Very quiet. No official channels. Just whispers to people like me. Whispers that pay very, very well. Lyra placed her plasma pistol on the counter, the heavy thud echoing in the small room. "We're not here to sell," she said, her voice cold. "We're here to give. For free. We have information that will burn the Concordance to the ground." Silas finally swiveled in his chair, his large, luminous eyes fixing on them. They held no malice, only an ancient, bottomless weariness. "Empires don't burn, child. They just change their masks. I've seen 3 of them rise and fall. Your truth will be a flicker in the dark, and then it will be gone. And so will you." Kalen stepped forward, his heart pounding. He placed the microdrive on the counter next to the pistol. "This isn't about an empire," he said, his voice shaking but clear. "This is about the thing that has been pruning empires for 3,000 years." He told Silas what he had found. He spoke of the Silence Bringers, of Protocol Chimera, of the ghosts who enforced the Great Calm. For the first time, a flicker of something other than cynicism crossed Silas's ancient face. It was a faint, almost imperceptible glimmer of fear. He picked up the microdrive, his long fingers caressing its smooth surface. "The gardeners," he whispered. The name a relic from a forgotten age. So the old stories are true. The whispers from the void. He plugged the drive into his terminal. For a long moment, the only sound was the clicking of his keyboard as he navigated the encrypted files. His eyes widened as he saw the raw data, the final transmissions, the concordance directives. He saw the truth, unvarnished and terrifying. "To release this," Silas said, his voice barely audible, "is to declare war on the very concept of order. The galaxy will not thank you. It will tear itself apart in fear and paranoia. Species will turn on species, suspecting each other of being in league with the gardeners. The great calm will be replaced by the great chaos." "It's a false calm, a lie," Kalen insisted. "The galaxy deserves to know it's living in a cage." "Deserves," Silas gave a dry, rattling laugh. "Deserve has nothing to do with it. Survival is all that matters. And for 3 millennia, this lie has ensured our survival. What you are proposing is a cure that is infinitely worse than the disease." Before they could argue further, the lights in the shop flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. The ambient noise of the station outside faded into an unsettling, profound silence. Not just a lack of sound, but an active, pressing quiet that felt heavy, like a physical weight. Kalen's blood ran cold. The silence. It was the same silence from the logs. Lyra drew her pistol, its internal power cell still active, casting a faint blue glow in the gloom. "Silas, what's happening?" Silas's voice was a strained whisper from the darkness. "They're here. They followed you." The front door of the shop didn't explode or break down. It simply dissolved, its molecules disassociating into a cloud of fine, gray dust that swirled and then vanished. Standing in the doorway were 2 figures. They were not armored soldiers or menacing aliens. They looked ordinary. They wore simple, gray, featureless tunics that seemed to absorb the light. Their faces were smooth, androgynous, and utterly devoid of expression. They were the perfect embodiment of anonymity. They were wardens. They didn't move. They simply stood there, their presence radiating an aura of absolute, unshakable calm. It was a calm that was more terrifying than any overt threat. One of them raised a hand, palm open, the plasma pistol in Lyra's hand. A reliable, brutally simple piece of hardware suddenly went dead. The blue glow vanished. The trigger mechanism seized. It was now just a useless lump of metal. "The information must not be disseminated," the first warden said. Its voice was not mechanical, not organic, but something in between. A perfectly modulated tone that was both male and female, soothing and utterly chilling. "It is a disruptive element. It compromises the stability of the current galactic cycle. Return the data, and you will be reintegrated. Your memories of this event will be pruned." "And if we refuse," Lyra snarled, dropping the useless pistol and pulling a long, wicked-looking vibroblade from her boot. The second warden tilted its head, a gesture of mild curiosity, like a scientist observing a peculiar insect. "Refusal is an indicator of systemic instability. Instability must be corrected." The tool of correction is not relevant. The outcome is. As it spoke, the antique computer terminals behind Silas began to spark and melt. The stacks of data slates glowed cherry red and then crumbled into ash. The very information in the room was being unmade, erased from existence. Silas, seeing his life's work turning to dust, let out a cry of rage and despair. He lunged at his main terminal, trying to shield it with his frail body. One of the wardens looked at him. Silas froze mid-lunge, his body going rigid. His luminous eyes went wide with a silent, internal scream, and then they faded to a dull, milky white. He crumpled to the floor, a puppet with its strings cut. He wasn't dead, not in a way they could understand. He was simply empty. His mind, his memories, his very consciousness had been pruned. Lyra screamed and charged, her vibroblade humming with energy. She was fast, a blur of motion born from 100 desperate brawls. But the warden didn't even try to dodge. It simply raised its hand again. The blade stopped an inch from its chest, its energy field fizzling out into nothing. The metal of the blade turned brittle and cracked, falling to the floor in a shower of metallic fragments. Lyra stared at her empty hand, her face a mask of shocked disbelief. This wasn't a fight. It was an impossibility. It was like trying to punch the concept of gravity. Kalen, who had been frozen in terror, finally acted. His mind, the mind of an archivist, saw the one thing the wardens hadn't yet destroyed, the microdrive, still plugged into Silas's now dead terminal. While the wardens were focused on Lyra, he dove for it, snatching it from the port. He scrambled back, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold it. "You want it?" he yelled, his voice cracking. "It's right here." The wardens turned their blank, emotionless faces toward him. "The data is an abstraction," the first one said. "Its physical vessel is irrelevant. We have already begun the process of erasing its mimetic signature from the galactic infosphere. In moments, it will be as if it never existed." Just as it spoke, a massive explosion rocked the station from somewhere above them. The floor buckled, and the emergency lights flickered on, casting the scene in a hellish red glow. A voice, human and frantic, crackled over a hidden speaker in Lyra's gear. "Lyra, you've got incoming Concordance Special Forces, heavy assault teams. They're cutting their way through the docking bay. They're not here to talk." It was a message from one of her contacts on the station. The Concordance had arrived, but they weren't here to save them. They were here to clean up, to erase the witnesses and bury the evidence of the warden's existence. The wardens tilted their heads in unison, a synchronized, unsettling motion. "An unscheduled complication," the second one said. "The Concordance acts with unnecessary crudeness. Their methods create chaos, not order." For a fraction of a second, the warden's absolute attention was diverted, their focus shifting to the new, noisier threat. It was the only opening they would get. "Now," Lyra screamed, tackling Kalen and dragging him toward a collapsed section of the back wall. They tumbled through the hole into a dark, reeking maintenance tunnel as another explosion shook the station to its core. Behind them, they heard the sound of heavy, armored footsteps and the sharp crackle of Concordance plasma rifles. They were caught in the crossfire, trapped between the silent, omnipotent ghosts who wanted to prune them from reality, and the brutal, desperate soldiers of the lie they had worked so hard to maintain. The maintenance tunnel was a claustrophobic hell of dripping pipes, exposed wiring, and the stench of decay. Behind them, the sounds of a one-sided battle raged. They heard the distinctive Sharp reports of Concordance plasma rifles, followed not by return fire, but by an unnerving, absolute silence. The soldiers weren't being killed, they were being unmade. The thought sent a fresh wave of terror through Kalen. They're not just erasing data, he gasped, scrambling to keep up with Lyra. They're erasing people. Silas, the soldiers, it's like we never existed. Focus, Lyra hissed, pulling him through a narrow gap in the machinery. Mourn later. Run now. Her face was a grim mask, her earlier bravado replaced by the hardened pragmatism of a survivor. She had seen impossible things, but the wardens were something beyond that. They were a violation of the natural order. They were a law of physics that had decided to become a person. They emerged into a vast, cavernous cargo bay, one of the station's main arteries. The scene was one of utter chaos. Civilians were screaming and running, a panicked herd with nowhere to go. Concordance enforcers in their polished silver armor were trying to form a perimeter, but their discipline lines were breaking. Their enemy wasn't charging them, it was simply appearing in their midst. One moment, a squad of enforcers was raising their weapons. The next, they would freeze, their eyes glazing over, before slumping to the ground. Empty shells. The wardens moved through the chaos like specters, untouched and untouchable. They ignored the panicked civilians, their focus absolute. They were pruning the Concordance forces with terrifying efficiency, their expressionless faces betraying no malice, only a sense of dispassionate, methodical purpose. They're not trying to kill everyone, Kalen realized, his analytical mind kicking in despite the fear. They're just removing the immediate threats, the most unstable elements. Great. So we're not a threat. We're a systemic instability. Lyra grunted, pulling him behind a stack of massive cargo containers. I feel so much better. From their hiding place, they saw something that made Kalen's blood freeze. High Archivist Thale stood in the center of the bay, flanked by a retinue of elite Concordance Justicars, their black armor a stark contrast to the silver of the enforcers. He was not cowering. He was observing the warden's work with a look of grim acceptance, as if watching a controlled burn. He had brought the Concordance here, not to fight the wardens, but to contain the mess Kalen had made. And now the wardens were cleaning up his clumsy attempt. He knew, Kalen whispered, the betrayal of fresh, sharp wound. Thale, he knew they would come. He led them right to us. A new sound cut through the chaos, the high-pitched whine of a ship's engines. Impossibly close. A Concordance gunship, a sleek, predatory vessel, had blasted its way through the bay's main viewport and was now hovering in the zero-G environment, its weapon ports glowing with malevolent energy. It wasn't firing at the wardens. It was aiming at the vagrant, still docked in the bay they had fled from. No! Lyra screamed, a cry of pure anguish. The gunship fired a single, brilliant lance of plasma. The vagrant, her battered, ugly, beautiful ship, her home, vaporized in a silent, blossoming flower of white-hot light. The destruction of the ship was a signal. Thale raised a hand, and the Concordance forces began a strategic withdrawal, their objective complete. They had erased the escape route, cornering their targets. They were leaving the rest to the wardens. The two wardens who had attacked them in Silas's shop now turned, their blank faces fixing on Kalen and Lyra's hiding place. The chaos in the bay began to subside, the civilians fleeing, the Concordance retreating. Soon, it would be just them and the ghosts. "They're boxing us in," Lyra said, her voice dangerously quiet. The loss of her ship had extinguished her fear and reforged it into a cold, hard rage. "They think we're trapped." She looked at Kalen, her eyes boring into him. "You said their power is to manipulate energy, to convince systems to just stop. But it's not magic. It's technology, and all technology has limits. It has rules." Kalen's mind raced, sifting through the fragmented data he had memorized from the microdrive. He recalled a degraded schematic from a long-extinct species, the Signians, a race of energy beings. They had been the first to be pruned. Their final, desperate log mentioned a frequency of nullity, a specific harmonic resonance that the Warden's technology could not easily manipulate. It was described as a decoherence wave, pure informational chaos. "The station's core," Kalen said, his eyes widening with a wild, desperate idea. "Zarathos isn't powered by a standard fusion reactor. It's too unstable. The founders used a contained singularity, a miniature black hole. Its event horizon emits a constant stream of chaotic energy, hawking radiation. It's pure, weaponized entropy." Lyra's eyes lit up with a dangerous fire. "Informational chaos," she breathed. "A place they're perfect. Ordered power can't touch. You think if we get close enough, it might shield us," Kalen finished. "Or it might tear us apart, atom by atom. But it's the only place on this rock they can't simply will out of existence." It was a suicide run. The reactor core was at the absolute center of the asteroid, sealed behind layers of security and radiation shielding. But the station was in chaos. The explosions had ruptured conduits and broken open service tunnels. They had a path. They ran, ducking through the panicked crowds and leaping over the inert bodies of Concordance soldiers. The Wardens did not pursue in a physical sense. They simply appeared ahead of them, blocking their path, their calm, impassive faces a silent judgment. They raised their hands. The metal deck plates at Kalen and Lyra's feet began to glow, the molecules heating up, preparing to dissolve. But just as the metal began to warp, Lyra threw something. It was a small, cylindrical object from her belt, a grav grenade, a tool used by asteroid miners to clear rock falls. It didn't explode. It imploded, creating a momentary, violent distortion in the local gravity field. The Wardens, for the first time, faltered. Their bodies shimmered, their forms momentarily losing cohesion, like a hologram caught in a magnetic field. Their power was tied to the stable laws of physics, and the grenade had just written a new, temporary law. It only lasted for a second, but it was enough. Kalen and Lyra scrambled past them, diving into a maintenance shaft as the deck plate behind them melted into a pool of glowing slag. "They're not invincible," Lyra panted, her face flushed with adrenaline. "They have to obey the rules of the universe, even if they can bend them. We just have to be more chaotic than they are orderly." Their journey to the core was a desperate now-running battle against the laws of reality. The Wardens were everywhere, not as individuals, but as a presence. Lights would go out. Gravity would shift. A solid wall would suddenly lose its atomic cohesion, becoming as thin as smoke. They survived on Lyra's brutal ingenuity and Kalen's encyclopedic knowledge of the station systems. She used her remaining tools, sonic charges, EMP bursts, kinetic dampeners to create localized pockets of physical chaos. He guided them through the labyrinth, rerouting power, triggering system overloads, and turning the station's own dying infrastructure into a weapon against the suffocating order of their pursuers. They finally reached the final access corridor to the reactor chamber. The air hummed with unimaginable power, and the light from the observation window was a stark, menacing purple. A single warden stood before the reinforced blast door, blocking their path. It was not one of the two from the shop. It was another, identical entity. It didn't raise its hand. It simply stood there, waiting. "Your efforts are illogical," it stated, its voice echoing in the humming corridor. "You cannot escape your function. You are a discordant note in a symphony that has played for millennia. You must be silenced." "Who are you?" Kalen demanded, his voice raw. "Why are you doing this?" The warden tilted its head. "We are the continuation of a purpose, a directive set in motion by a species that achieved perfect order and then transcended it. They saw the inevitable cycle of the galaxy expansion, conflict, collapse, a chaotic, wasteful, painful algorithm. They created us to correct it. We are not conquerors. We are shepherds, guiding the flock away from the cliff's edge. By throwing them off it yourselves," Lyra spat. "Your purpose is a lie." The warden continued, its voice calm and unwavering. "This cycle of chaos is finite. We have cultivated this galaxy for 3,000 years. It is on the cusp of achieving a state of permanent, stable harmony. Your truth would undo that work. It would reset the symphony to its chaotic, violent beginning. Millions of worlds, trillions of lives, spared from war by our work, would be cast back into the fire. Is your truth worth that price?" For the first time, Kalen hesitated. The warden's logic was terrifying, but it was not entirely without merit. Had the great calm, the peace he had cherished his entire life, truly been worth the price of ignorance? Was he a liberator, or was he a fool about to unleash a holocaust on a peaceful galaxy? All for the sake of an abstract principle. He looked at Lyra, who stood defiant, her face set like stone. He looked at the microdrive clutched in his hand. He thought of the dying screams in the Ishtari caskets, of Silas's empty eyes. The peace was a lie, a beautiful, tranquil, and monstrous lie. "A peace that grows in a graveyard is not peace," Kalen said, his voice finding a strength he never knew it had. "It's an extinction." He lunged for the door's control panel. The warden moved, not with physical speed, but with a chilling inevitability. But Lyra was ready. She didn't attack it. She activated her last device, a powerful magnetic clamp used for ship-to-ship docking. She threw it not at the warden, but at the ceiling above it, where a massive, unsecured power conduit ran. The magnet slammed into the conduit, rupturing it. A torrent of raw, unshielded energy arced down. A miniature lightning storm. It wasn't a weapon. It was pure, chaotic power. The warden was engulfed. Its form flickered violently, its calm facade breaking as it fought to control the chaotic energy. It let out a sound, not of pain, but of static, of a signal being overwhelmed. While it was distracted, Kalen slapped his hand on the panel. The massive blast door slid open. The chamber beyond was a maelstrom of raw power. In the center, suspended in a web of magnetic fields, was a perfect sphere of absolute blackness, the singularity. The radiation it bled was not just energy, it was a physical manifestation of chaos, a place where the laws of cause and effect were frayed to their breaking point. They stumbled inside, the gravity warping around them, the air crackling with static. Kalen looked back. The warden stood at the threshold, its form still flickering, unable or unwilling to enter the zone of pure entropy. Its blank face seemed, for the first time, to hold something akin to frustration. It had lost them. They were inside the one place in the galaxy its power could not reach. They were alive. They were shielded. And they still had the truth. Inside the reactor chamber, the universe was a screaming symphony of chaos. The singularity pulsed at the heart of the maelstrom, a perfect sphere of non-existence that warped space, time, and perception. Gravity pulled in 3 directions at once. The air tasted of ozone and tasted like the color purple. Kalen felt his consciousness fraying at the edges, his orderly, logical mind struggling to find purchase in a reality that refused to obey its own rules. Lyra, however, seemed almost at home. She moved with a strange, fluid grace, her body instinctively compensating for the shifting physics, her eyes alight with a wild, fierce energy. "It's beautiful," she yelled over the roar of collapsing probabilities. "The one thing their perfect order can't tame." They were safe, for now. The warden remained at the threshold, a still, silent figure silhouetted against the relative normalcy of the corridor, a priest of order unable to step onto the unholy ground of chaos. But their sanctuary was also a prison. The singularity's chaotic field was expanding, destabilizing from the damage the station had sustained. The magnetic containment field was flickering, and the entire asteroid groaned around them, the sound of a dying beast. They had minutes, maybe hours, before Zarathos tore itself apart. "We're shielded, but we're trapped," Kalen shouted, his words seeming to hang in the air for a moment before reaching Lyra. "The drive is useless if it dies with us." "Then we don't let it die," Lyra replied, her gaze fixed on the singularity. "You said the warden's power is informational. They convince systems to fail. What if we can convince them to work?" The idea was insane, a product of the chaotic energies swirling around them. The station's main communications array was destroyed. There was no way to broadcast anything. "Not with the station's array," Kalen said, his mind catching the spark of her desperate logic. "But the singularity, it doesn't just radiate energy, it radiates information, pure, unstructured data. It's connected to the very fabric of space-time. If we could somehow encode the data from the drive onto the Hawking radiation, we could turn their greatest weakness into the galaxy's loudest megaphone." Lyra finished, a grin spreading across her face. "Broadcast the truth on a frequency they can't touch, powered by a source they can't control." It was a feat of theoretical physics that would have taken a team of scientists a century to even conceptualize. They had only moments. They scrambled to the primary containment field console, a massive, archaic piece of machinery that was somehow still functioning. Lyra, with her intuitive grasp of technology, began rerouting the dregs of the station's power, bypassing fried circuits and melted conduits to create a stable energy source. Kalen, his archivist's mind now working with a speed and clarity born of pure desperation, plugged the microdrive into the console's diagnostic port. He wasn't a physicist, but he was a master of data structures. He began to write a new kind of code, not for a machine, but for reality itself. He translated the raw data, the logs, the files, protocol chimera into a simple, brutal binary stream, a mimetic virus designed to be carried on the chaotic waves of the Singularity's radiation. Outside the chamber, the warden's strategy shifted. They could not enter the chamber, but they could dismantle the station around it. The groans of tortured metal grew louder, bulkheads compressed. The very rock of the asteroid began to crack and splinter. High Archivist Thale, watching from the bridge of his command ship, saw the energy readings from Zarathos spike into impossible levels. "They're destabilizing the Singularity," his science officer reported, her voice trembling. "They'll destroy the entire nebula." "No," Thale said, his face a mask of horrified realization. "They're not destroying it. They're using it." He understood now. They weren't just running, they were fighting back, using a weapon his sterile, ordered mind could never have conceived of. He had unleashed a force of chaos that not even the wardens could control. Back in the chamber, Kalen typed the final line of code. The console sparked, and the data stream began to flow. Not into a network, but directly into the magnetic containment field, modulating the chaotic frequencies of the Singularity itself. The sphere of blackness at the center of the room seemed to flicker. For a single, heart-stopping moment, the entire galaxy held its breath. And then it heard. On the tranquil spires of Xylos, in the bustling trade hubs of the core worlds, on forgotten colonies in the outer rim, a message bloomed. It did not come over comm channels or hollow screens. It appeared as a ghost in the machine, a whisper in the subconscious, a sudden, chilling certainty in the heart of every sentient being. They saw images of silent, black ships. They heard the final, desperate cries of the Cathar and the Signans. They felt the cold, dispassionate logic of Protocol Chimera. They learned the name of the Gardeners. They understood, in one collective, terrifying instant, that the great calm was a lie. The peace they had known was the silence of a cage. On the bridge of the Concordance ship, Thale watched in horror as the faces of his crew turned from discipline to dawning, terrified comprehension. They were looking at him now, not as a leader, but as a jailer. His authority, built on a foundation of serene lies, evaporated in an instant. The symphony was over. The discordant note had become the chorus. In the reactor chamber, as the station began its final, shuddering collapse, Kalen and Lyra watched the Singularity pulse with the rhythm of their broadcast. They had done it. They had given the galaxy back its stolen, violent, and magnificent truth. "What happens now?" Kalen asked, his voice quiet amidst the roar. "They fight," Lyra said, her eyes reflecting the chaotic light. "They fight the ghosts. They fight the liars. They fight for the right to make their own mistakes. It'll be ugly and bloody and terrifying, and it'll be real." The warden still stood at the threshold, its form flickering as the station disintegrated around it. It looked at them, and, for the first time, Kalen thought he saw an emotion on its blank face. Not anger, not hatred. It was confusion, a perfect, logical machine facing an illogical, impossible outcome. Its purpose, the directive it had followed for millennia, had been rendered obsolete. The garden had overgrown its walls. As the containment field finally failed, the Singularity consumed the chamber, and then the station, in a final, brilliant flash of chaotic light. But Kalen and Lyra were not there. In the last possible second, a ship had appeared just outside the collapsing station. It was not a Concordance vessel, nor was it a sleek warden craft. It was a cobbled-together fleet of freighters, mining barges, and pirate cruisers, the disenfranchised, the forgotten, the denizens of Zarathos, who had seen the truth and chosen a side. They had latched onto the chamber with a tractor beam, pulling the two architects of chaos from the jaws of oblivion just as they closed. Weeks later, Kalen stood on the bridge of a stolen Concordance frigate, rechristened the Unknowing. He was no longer an archivist, he was a symbol. Lyra stood beside him, no longer a lone smuggler, but the admiral of a nascent and chaotic fleet. The galaxy was on fire. The Concordance had fractured, its authority shattered by the truth. Systems were declaring independence. Old feuds, suppressed for centuries by the Warden's chilling peace, were reigniting. It was the great chaos Silas had predicted, but it was also a renaissance. Species long thought to be enemies were forming new alliances, united by a common spectral foe. The Wardens were still out there, their silent ships moving through the void, but they were no longer ghosts. They were a known enemy, and across 1,000 worlds, people were learning to fight back, not with weapons of energy, but with weapons of chaos, unpredictable strategies, illogical fleet movements, technologies based on chance and probability. They were fighting order with glorious, untamed, and beautiful chaos. Kalen looked out at the star chart, a swirling, burning map of a galaxy reborn in fire and truth. The path ahead was uncertain, violent, and perilous. But it was theirs. For the first time in 3,000 years, the future was not written. The silence was broken, and in the glorious, terrifying noise of a galaxy finding its own voice, Kalen finally found his peace.